In the shadow of endless rows of miners' cottages and tall slag heaps that dominated the landscape, the men of a London Irish football team kicked a leather ball into action, signalling the start of the Battle of Loos. Were they those who played the greatest game of all? We've returned to the Loos battlefield for this episode, and this area around Loos, or Loos-en-Goël, the village that gives this sector its name, forms part of what in recent years has become known as the Forgotten Front, that lesser visited part of the British battlefields of the Great War that runs from the town of Armentières, home of the famous Mademoiselle from Armentières, up on the Franco-Belgian border, down to the grounds, the coalfields around the city of Loos or Lens. For much of the war here, the front was static, but particularly in the year 1915, there was a whole series of battles, from the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, the first British offensive in this area in March of 1915, through to fighting along the Albers Ridge and Festubert and Givenchy, and then eventually here at Loos with the big operation, the big push as it was called at the time, with the Battle of September and October of 1915. The battlefield area at Loos covered a roughly 10-mile front from the village of Givenchy-les-Labassés, or Givenchy as the troops called it, just north of the Labassé Canal, and then down through the flats, coalfields around the villages like Vermelles and Alky-les-Labassés and Hulloch, down to close to the village of Loos. And where we are for this episode is on the southern flank of the Loos advance, close to the city of Lens, where the men of the 47th London Division made their attack on the 25th of September 1915. The 47th London Division was originally known as the 2nd London Division. It was a pre-war formation drawn from territorial army, as we'd call it now, battalions of the London regiments. Now, these were not full-time soldiers, so they were men that had signed up for territorial service, and that meant that they would go to an annual camp every year, they would attend a local drill hall for regular sessions of training and so on. But what that meant was they could continue to carry on their normal civilian life and their normal civilian occupation. So these men worked, many of them worked in and around the city of London, and then on regular basis they would go and join their units. It was formed into localised companies by each battalion, and there would be a drill hall in an area where the men could go to close to where they lived. And then for each year they would have an annual camp where the whole battalion came together, and in theory, in the lead up to the Great War, the units that made up the division would be brought together for training as well, although that didn't always happen. The sort of units that were in this London division were essentially locally raised units. They either covered a particular area. So the 22nd London Regiment that was part of it was the Queen's Battalion, and that recruited from the southern parts of London down towards the Surrey border, for example. But there were others that focused on particular trades. So there was an 8th Battalion of the London Regiment, which was the Post Office Rifles, recruited from men who worked for the London Post Office. Not necessarily all postmen, but sorting staff, counter clerks, and all the other support staff that ran the post office at that time. There was the 15th London Regiment, Civil Service Rifles, and they were recruited from men who worked within the civil service in London. Their headquarters was Somerset House, for example. And then you had ones that were based in particular districts of London. So there was the Poplar and Stepney Rifles, the 17th Battalion, the London Regiment, or the St Pancras Battalion, the 19th London Regiment. Now, many of these battalions recruited in quite heavily working class areas. So some battalions represented the working class community of London, and others, like the Civil Service Rifles, for example, probably reflected more of the middle class part of London. But it was quite a diverse division in many respects, and one that was ready for service quite early on in the Great War, but was not sent to France until March of 1915. It then occupied the line in the northern part of what we call now the Forgotten Front, so between Armentières and the Labassé Canal, and it took part in some of the operations around Festubert and Givenchy in the early summer of 1915, and then was moved down to this sector to take part in the Battle of Loos. And the attack here on the 25th of September 1915 was the first time as a division the whole division would go into action, go over the top into a major battle. After the war, it was a division, and this is a common thread with many of these territorial divisions. It was a division that had a very strong old comrades association. So the survivors who had fought in battles like Loos were able to meet up and talk amongst themselves on a regular basis, which I'm sure, given the lack of general support networks that existed after the war, this was a good thing for many of them. But it also led to the creation of a divisional memorial, in fact 2 on the Somme, one at High Wood and one at Martinpuy. I always found it a bit strange that nothing had been placed here at Loos, which was their baptism of fire. Perhaps there just wasn't a location that was suitable enough for a divisional memorial to go in. But they also published a very, very good divisional history, which has been reprinted, but it's also available online to download for free as a digital file. So if you've got a relative that served in that formation, you can get a bit more information about what the division and the units within it were doing during those years of the war, because the division went on to fight right through to the last phase of the fighting on the Western Front in November of 1918. So this walk will very much have a London theme to it, because on this southern sector of the Loos battlefield in September 1915, it was London battalions that took part in the fighting here. But we're starting at Maroc British Cemetery, and this is located in a mining suburb called the Cité Maroc, Maroc referring to Morocco, a French colony at the time. And indeed there were many other housing estates, mining areas in this region that had references to the French colonies and colonial locations. So there was a Cité Madagascar, for example, not far away as well. And this northern part of France was very much an industrial area. It's not the prettiest part of France. At the time of the Great War, there would have been rows and rows of miners' cottages in this area, very similar to the mining communities in the north of England, and indeed where I live in South Yorkshire, there's a lot of resonance between this area and places like Hulloch and Vermel and Loos, and here at Cité Maroc with the sort of communities that existed here in Elsica and in places like Manvers, Rotherham and indeed beyond. Scattered amongst these rows and rows of miners' cottages would have been the pit heads, the fosse as they were called, and these would have been big metal lifting gear that raised the cages that the miners went up and down into the mining galleries. And close by and very visible on the landscape would have been the huge mountains of coal slag, all of this giving a very industrial feel to this region of France. And indeed after the Great War all of that was restored, so when we come here today we can see these coal mountains stretching across this area. We can see the restored mining cottages and the rows of terraced housing, although as in Great Britain the mining industry has not existed here as a working industry for many decades now. The only accessible mine that still functions in any degree or form is a mining museum just on the other side of Lens. But for Germany, of course, the capture of this richest coal seam in France was a great bonus in 1914. The German army swept through here in that race to the sea, captured this ground, and were able to access the mines and obviously take the coal for their own war effort. So it became an area of great importance, obviously, to both sides. So standing here today in the modern world, in a region that has not seen coal mining for many, many years, we can still see the detritus of it everywhere. The cemetery sits in the middle of quite a bustling little village here. And as we stand on the path outside the cemetery, we can see it's quite a large one, covering an area from our left to right, a sort of a rectangle shape. And it was a cemetery that originally had been started by the French in the summer of 1915. British burials were not made here until January 1916, and the 47th London Division, who'd fought at Loos, were the ones that first used the cemetery. Now, considering that they've been fighting here the previous September, why is there no British graves in here from that period? Well, in the initial burials anyway. Well, the reason was that there were other cemeteries, and we'll mention one of those a little bit further on into the walk. Once it was established, effectively it became a front line cemetery for the units that held the line around Lens and the ground that had been captured in the Battle of Loos here in 1915. So when men were killed in the front line in the day-to-day activities of trench warfare, they were brought back here to Maroc Cemetery for burial. Post-war, it was selected as a site to become a concentration cemetery for this area of the battlefield, so graves were moved in, and that's when some of the Battle of Loos casualties that had been buried out onto the battlefield were brought in here for reburial. Now there's 1,379 British and Commonwealth burials in the cemetery, along with 45 French that still remain and some German burials as well. There are 264 unidentified British and Commonwealth burials, so the vast majority of the men, well over 1,000, are identified soldiers. So it makes it an important cemetery from that point of view, because it reflects the men and the units that passed through this area from the post-Battle of Loos period up towards the end of the war. And it's dominated by the different units that served in this sector of the front, from the London Division through to one of the regular divisions that was here, and then later on the 46th North Midland Division, who spent a lot of time around Lens, having moved up to this area after the attack and the fighting around Gommecourt in 1916. From the point of view of the walk, and we'll come back to the story of that later on in the walk when we go to the spot where they were originally buried, there was a battlefield burial site of men from the 1st 6th Battalion, the London Regiment. Their nickname was the Cast Iron Six, and they buried their men on the battlefield, on the spots where they'd fallen in September 1915. Post-war, they were moved to this cemetery into what is really a sort of a unique burial site. So there's a curbstone marking the actual site of the grave, and then what's called a Kipling stone, which is the special sort of obelisk stone that marks the site of special memorials, records that the 87 officers and men of the 6th Londons that this grave commemorates are recorded individually on headstones that line the wall of the cemetery. So it's very unusual in that respect. Now, I've recently been writing up this cemetery for my book on the Forgotten Front, on the battlefields from Armentières to Lens, that will be published by Pen and Sword later on this year. And one of the things that I noticed, that there was quite a high number of teenage Tommies in here. There were 9 17-year-olds, 4 of them Canadian, and 1 16-year-old, Private Edward Pearce of the 21st Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, who was killed in this sector on the 24th of July 1916, aged only 16. He was from Highgate in London. Now, when you look at these lads, you see that they're a mixture of legitimate teenage Tommies. So some of them are territorials, and you could legitimately join the territorial force before the war under the age of 18. You, strictly speaking, shouldn't have been sent overseas, but in the early period of the war, that seems to have been ignored, and quite a lot of youngsters did go over with their battalions. But others are lads who lied about their age, that were big physically enough to pass as an older soldier and managed to get into the army, whether that was the Canadian forces or the British forces. And young Edward Pearce, who died at the age of 16, had joined up the previous year in 1915 into the Middlesex Regiment and had lied about his age to get in, one of thousands and thousands of these young lads who volunteered to serve in the early phase of the war. Richard Van Emden, who we had on an earlier podcast, is continuing his research on this, and he's discovering more and more of these men. And I believe he has a new edition of his book, Teenage Tommies, coming out fairly soon, and that'll be very interesting to read that when it's released. One of the most senior officers buried in here is Lieutenant Colonel Charles Joseph Wilkie. He was the commanding officer of the 17th Battalion of the Welsh Regiment, which was a Bantam battalion, a battalion specifically formed to recruit men who would normally have not passed the minimum height requirement for going into the army. So these were men who were below the height of 5'3", which was that minimum requirement. And they formed these Bantam battalions, and there was a large number of them in different regiments of the British Army, and they were brought together into Bantam divisions, the 35th and the 40th. And although some of the army obviously did take the mickey when they saw these short stature soldiers, when you think about it, really, to fight in the trenches of the Great War, it's a benefit to be of short stature, because you don't want to have your head poking over the top of the parapet. And both these divisions, on the Somme and at places like Boulogne Wood in 1917 with the 40th Division, they really showed the true mettle of these men. And there's a very good book on the story of the Bantams. It's called The Bantams by Sidney Allison. He's a Canadian author whose father was in one of the Canadian Bantam battalions, and it's a book that's still in print, and we'll put reference to it on the Old Frontline website, oldfrontline.co.uk. So Colonel Wilkie was commanding one of these battalions of Bantams, a Welsh Bantam battalion, and he himself had been born in Australia. He'd served in the regular army in the Boer War, and then had raised and trained and then brought this battalion, the 17th Welsh, to France in June of 1916. He was killed by a high explosive shell on the 18th of October of the same year, very close to the double crassier, which we'll see later on in this walk. And what he was doing, he was a typical battalion commander. He would have had a command post somewhere in this Cité Maroc area, and he could have run his battalion in the front line from that. But these commanding officers didn't operate like that. They needed to go into the trenches to see what their men were doing, to see the conditions that their men were in, and to make sure everything was in order. And he would do often daily rounds, and it was during one of these daily rounds that he went up into the forward area of the battlefield, and a high explosive shell killed him and his second in command, Captain Charles Vivian Lyne, who's buried next to him here at Maroc Cemetery. So these battalion commanders, which are quite a senior position within the army, commanding a battalion of men, they aren't a rarity to find their graves on the battlefields, because these men led by example and often paid for that example with their lives. Also in here is a little plot of men from the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, and the 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, whose dates of death are the 30th of June 1916. Now this is the day before the Battle of the Somme, and on that day at different parts of the front there were some diversionary attacks to try and draw German attention away from what would happen the following day down on the Somme. The most famous of them was at Richebourg, involving other battalions of the Royal Sussex Regiment in the Battle of the Boar's Head. But there was one such episode here at the Double Crassier as well, where both these battalions, 2nd Royal Sussex and 2nd KRRC, made their attack in the area, the trenches around the Double Crassier itself. And the dead that could be recovered from the battlefield were brought back here for burial. There's a curious little thing though, because where we are, we're very close to the Loos Memorial. In fact, later on in the walk, as we get up towards where the front line trenches, you'll see across the fields to the walls of the Loos Memorial. The men of the Royal Sussex Regiment who were missing from that attack, whose bodies could not be recovered, their names are on the Loos Memorial. But the 2nd King's Royal Rifle Corps men, who were killed essentially alongside them, their names are on the Arras Memorial to the missing. And I suspect this is because the dividing line between the jurisdiction of those two memorials to the missing probably cuts through this Lens area, and the different record officers that submitted their names for commemoration on these monuments may have not really been aware of which monument really was the most appropriate one for them to be commemorated on. It's only a minor point, and these men aren't incorrectly commemorated in any shape or form, but it shows the complexity really, in particular with the story of the missing, as to how these men would be commemorated. Otherwise, as we wander through this cemetery, which in sections is largely in date order, we get a sense of the casualties that could be suffered just by holding the line. This doesn't really reflect the great battles of the First World War, this cemetery. It's the day-to-day activity of trench warfare. Yet, men could be killed almost every day that a battalion was in the line here, and we see that represented amongst the graves. We'll return to the main entrance, come out onto the street again, we'll turn left. We're going to walk down there and head down to the site of one of the former mining areas, just up ahead on the right hand side. To get to this next location, we've walked down the D165, the road from Maroc British Cemetery towards Loos, and we've gone past on the left some modern industrial units. And as we come up on the right, we get to an overgrown area where there's a red and white barrier over an entranceway into what is now a park, and this is the site of the Fosse No. 5 de Béthune. This was one of the main pits, the collieries that was here before the Great War, restored afterwards, and then eventually closed sometime in the 1970s. The reason we've come to this particular point is this was the location of one of the original cemeteries from the 47th London Division attack on Loos in September 1915. The dead were buried in the grounds of this, which the buildings of the pit were used by field ambulances of the Royal Army Medical Corps to treat the wounded coming back, and essentially a regimental divisional, in this case cemetery, was established in the grounds of it as well. So quite a lot of in particular the officers that were killed leading their men into the attack here from the different London battalions, like the London Irish Rifles and the 19th Londons, and also the Cast Iron 6 and the 7th Londons. Some of them were buried here, and their graves remained here until the early 1920s, when this cemetery was not quite big enough to be maintained indefinitely, or possibly the mining company that ran this particular colliery wanted the ground back, essentially. They wanted to carry on their work here, and the cemetery just wouldn't be possible to maintain it under those circumstances. So the graves were not moved to Morocco at that point, which is interesting. They were moved instead to Dud Corner Cemetery, the walls of which would eventually become the Loos Memorial. That site had been chosen alongside the main Lens Bethune Road as a main concentration cemetery for the Loos battlefield. So the men that were buried here were moved pretty much en masse to the same plots, same area of the cemetery, and their graves can be found there today. And this is typical not just of this area of the battlefields, but right across the British sector of the Western Front. There were lots of these small battalion, brigade or divisional burial sites, or burial sites that connected to a particular area or time period of the war that were just not big enough to maintain indefinitely, but the decision was then made because of that to move them into a larger cemetery. And it's now that the War Graves Commission have digitised their records that we can look up a casualty and see where he was originally brought in from, and we're beginning to discover more about the names and the size and who was included in some of these wartime burial sites. So again, it's all part of the ever-changing knowledge, really, of the First World War. So when we come to the battlefields today, and here around Loos and up right across this forgotten front of the First World War, there are a lot of cemeteries here, but once there would have been many, many more. Perhaps 10 or 20 times as more cemeteries than we see on certain parts of the battlefield today. And when you look at the original registers of the cemeteries that do survive, like Morocco or Dud Corner, the substantial cemeteries that were moved in there are often listed by name, and the details of the casualties are in there, but not every single cemetery. So if it was only 10 or 20 graves from a particular action, that isn't necessarily listed in the register. You have to work your way through the casualties and the records that are now digitised to try and find that out. But it just shows that, we often come with groups to the battlefields, and people say, well, my granddad was in the Suffolk Regiment, where's the Suffolk Cemetery? Or my uncle was in the Yorkshire Regiment, where is the Yorkshire, the Greenhoward Cemetery? And there are cemeteries, both in the case of the Suffolks and the Yorkshires, where you can find that, but there once would have probably been many more. And I'm originally from Sussex, and I've looked through some of the records, and there were indeed a couple of Royal Sussex cemeteries at different parts of the front. So again, that part of how these cemeteries, when they were far more numerous than they are now, reflected the different units that passed through here. Sometimes that's been lost in their amalgamation into the larger post-war concentration cemeteries. So that's why we've pulled into here. This is now an overgrown, it's an abandoned mining area. Like I say, it's more of a park these days, but nevertheless, it's still an area that connects us to an aspect of the history here in the First World War. But we'll return to the main road. We're going to turn right here and head up the road, and then further up we turn left on the Rue de Hero de la Resistance. We follow that gradually uphill past some modernish houses on the right hand side to the top, where the road kinks slightly onto what's called the Chemin de Mazingarbe, and we follow that past the pylon out into the open fields, where we get a very good vista of this part of the battlefield, and we can see the twin peaks of the double Crassier, the Terrils de Loos as they're called now, just over on our right. And here we'll stop. So where we're standing now, we have a very good view over this northern part of the London Division attack here in the Battle of Loos in September 1915. This was where the men of the 1st 18th Battalion of the London Regiment, the London Irish Rifles, went over to the attack. Coming up behind them was the 1st 19th London Regiment, the St Pancras Battalion, who would pass through them and continue towards the village of Loos. And where we're standing now, if the road ahead of us is 12 o'clock, to our right, at 1 o'clock in the distance there in the dip, is the village of Loos itself, and that's the direction that part of the London attack headed towards. The twin slag heap to our right at about 3 o'clock, that is the site of the double Crassier. It's just in front of it, in fact. We'll see that closer up when we get there later on in the walk. But the twin peaks of it are much later coal slag heaps from the post-First World War period up to the time when the mines here were closed in the 1960s and 70s. But it gives us a good marker point when we're on all of the parts of the Loos battlefield, and indeed you can see it from quite some distance away, from Vimy Ridge and up in the north, and from parts of the Messines Ridge in Flanders. You can look to the south and see these two high points. So the 1st 18th London Regiment, who attacked from here, they were the London Irish Rifles. So this was a battalion formed like the London Scottish, recruited from the Scottish community in London. This one was recruited from the Irish community in London. And within it were members of the London Irish Football Club, and they were determined, when the attack would go in on the 25th of September, to get a football into action that day as a symbolic thing, to have a big kick-off for the big push and kick a ball towards the enemy lines as they made their attack. One of the men in the London Irish Rifles left this account of the battle. One set of our men, keen footballers, made a strange resolution. It was to take a football along with them. The platoon officer discovered this and ordered the football to be sent back, which of course was carried out. But the old members of the London Irish Football Club were not to be done out of the greatest game of their lives, the last to some of them, poor fellows, and just before Major Beresford gave the signal, the leather turned up again mysteriously. Suddenly the officer in command gave the signal, "Over you go, lads." With that the whole line sprang up as one man, some with a prayer, not a few making the sign of the cross. But the footballers, they chucked the ball over and went after it just as cool as if on the field, passing it from one to the other, though bullets were flying thick as hail, crying, "On the ball, London Irish," just as they might have done at Forest Hill. I believe that they actually kicked it right across into the enemy's trench with the cry, "Goal!" though not long before some of them had been picked off on the way. An excellent new book on this by Ed Harris, called The Footballer of Loos, identifies the man that kicked off this ball into the attack as Rifleman Frank Edwards. He was in his early 20s. He was a married stationery assistant who worked in the City of London, and this was his first time in action. His part in the story, his identification as being the man that kicked that football into action, had been lost in the mists of time, but this new book has recovered the story and tells it properly. Rifleman Edwards survived the war, and he died in 1964, and became one of many men connected to the football story of the Great War. From here we continue along this track. It takes us across the British front line, and one of the great things when you come to battlefields like this now, if you've got the excellent Linesman product from Great War Digitals, which uses GPS correlated trench maps so you can see where you are on the First World War landscape, you can actually get to the point where the actual British front line was, see where you are, and then walk across no man's land. But the further you go along here, you'll come into that no man's land area. As you get towards the end of the track where it goes off to the right, if you stop just before that then look back, you're looking at it then from the German perspective. And you'll see from here that the Germans had a pretty good view across this part of the battlefield. Originally their line had been a little bit further forward. The French had fought here in the early period of the war and pushed the Germans back from around the neighbouring village of Vermelles, for example. So this wasn't the original line, but nevertheless it still afforded the Germans quite some advantage. But the bombardment, and more importantly for the London lads, the gas used here for the first time by the British in the Great War, had pretty much suppressed the German defenders. And what you see with indeed most of the London attack that day is the capture of the front line was relatively easy. It was beyond that once the Germans had had a chance to react, and the gas was not as effective as it had originally been. The Germans then come back fighting hard and using counter-attacks, try to push the London lads out of the positions that they've gained. From here we'll continue down the Chemin de Mazingarbe. We'll follow it down the hill to the houses close to the D165. We'll then walk straight across the D165 in the continuation of the Chemin de Mazingarbe. It weaves round and then joins the main road, which is the Bethune-Lens Road. If we look up to our left, we can see the Dud Corner Cemetery and Loos Memorial up on the high ground there. But we'll turn right and walk down the path along the main road. It's quite a busy one. This is not the best place to walk, but we'll take this bit of the route, and that'll take us a little bit further down to a small roundabout where we'll turn right into the Rue des Rigenaux, and that'll enable us to walk up to the area, the scrubby trees and some houses just up ahead where the double Crassier was located. To get to this part of the battlefield, we've come down this minor road. It kinks slightly around the area of the modern slag heap that's here, to where it straightens out a little bit again near to some houses, and at this point we're close to the original end tip, if you like, of the double crassier. What was the double crassier? Well, it was a long, elongated slag heap with a railway line on the top of it, presumably to bring the slag directly from the mine. In this case, it was Fosse 11 de Lens, the local pit for this part of the area, and then dump it here. In 1914, it had become part of the German defences here, being a rising bit of ground here, but essentially fairly flat. This elevation of coal slag gave the Germans an advantage, a height advantage, and obviously an advantage in observation over this part of the battlefield. So it was incorporated into their defences. At 0 hour, 6:30 a.m. on the 25th of September 1915, the men of the 1st 6th London Regiment, the Cast Iron 6th, and the 1st 7th London Regiment, the Shiny 7th, they attacked towards this position where we're standing now, with the 6th Londons on the left and the 7th Londons on the right. Their objective was to get into the German lines here and take the ground around the double crassier. Gas had been released about 40 minutes before 0 hour and had done quite a good job again in suppressing the German defenders here. So the front line area around the area where there's houses just up ahead at a little crossroads was taken fairly early on. But the real serious fighting was in and around the crassier. The Germans were not going to give up this advantageous point easily, and it turned into a battle here when you read the different regimental accounts of the bombers. So these were men using grenades. Now, at this stage of the war, when we think of First World War hand grenades, British ones, we think of the Mills hand grenade, the number 5 grenade, which was quite a powerful fragmentation bomb. And they were just being introduced at this period of the war. The bulk of the men who fought at Loos and in these battles in this forgotten front in 1915 were using the various, and there was quite a lot of different types of grenades that were available to the British forces at this time, from official issue ones that had been deployed to British troops once the war had become static during the winter of 1914-15, and in this case grenades like the number 1 Mark II grenade. It looked a little bit like a rounder's bat. It was a wooden handle with a charge on the top with a metal ring around it that fragmented when the bomb exploded. You pulled a pin on it and there was about a 5.5 second fuse, and you threw it at the Germans. It was a bit of a top-heavy grenade, not desperately brilliant in design, but this lack of good official kit led to the development of unofficial kit. So improvised grenades, the jam tin bomb being an example of that, where jam tins, the plum and apple jam, which was issued in huge amounts to the army, scoffed down. The tin could then be packed with gun cotton explosive and a short wick fuse, lit and then thrown at the enemy. But there was also things like the Batty bomb. Major Batty of the Royal Engineers designed this cast iron grenade that would fragment, and it was made in an iron factory in Bethune behind the lines and then sent out to the troops in this sector. You still see them occasionally turn up on the battlefields here, the little cast iron objects with the indentation to make them fragment in them, with a wooden top to them and a wick fuse coming out, and the charge inside was black powder. And the issue with a lot of these improvised grenades, and indeed some of the official ones, particularly in the fighting here around the double crassier, it's mentioned in quite a lot of the regimental accounts, is that it was damp, and the damp got into the fuses and it got into the charges, and the grenades didn't work properly. Now, a few months later, with the beginning of the widespread introduction of the Mills grenade, that wouldn't have been a problem. The Mills grenade was a very effective grenade in trench warfare, very powerful, and if you threw it into a confined space, very few people were going to come out of there alive. So that would have given the bombers in this battle a bit of an advantage. But here, using these improvised grenades and the official ones, it was much more of a problem. So what you find is they start using enemy grenades, German grenades. Quite a few of the accounts describe how the men picked up German stick grenades and German egg grenades and Kugelgranaten, the large German fragmentation grenade, and they begin to use those against the Germans in this battle. Now, despite this problem with the grenades, it is, for the 6th Londons and the 7th Londons, a successful attack. They push the Germans back, and this top end of the double crassier is captured. This then marked the high tide mark, really, of the advance at Loos in this area in September 1915, although to the north, Loos village, and beyond that, the lower slopes of Hill 70 were taken. This was as far as the London units were meant to go, because beyond here were the complex streets, the urban environment of the city of Lens, which was not really suited for fighting. The idea of the Battle of Loos was to try and bypass Lens anyway, so they weren't going to go any further than this, and this became the new British front line. And after the battle here, the 6th Londons buried their dead, those 87 officers and men, in a battlefield burial site directly opposite the Double Crassier, and that remained here until it was moved to Maroc Cemetery, the grave that we saw at the beginning of the walk. And although the front line here remained static until the Germans withdrew from this side of Lens in 1917 and pulled back, and then this became an area behind the British lines. You'll also remember from when we were at Maroc Cemetery, there were those graves of the Royal Sussex and the King's Royal Rifle lads who were killed here in that attack on the 30th of June 1916. Now that attack is well described in an excellent memoir of the First World War, Somme Harvest, by Giles Eyre. This book is quite rare in the first edition, but there's been a reprint of it, and again we'll put references to that on the podcast website. Eyre goes on to be wounded and captured at High Wood in the Battle of the Somme, and most of the book really is about that, but he describes the attack here because one of the men in his platoon is Rifle William Mariner VC, who'd been awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery in the fighting a little bit further away in some of the battles of 1915. He's often called the Convict VC because for many years it was believed that he'd been a prisoner at Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight and had been given a choice: remain in prison or go to the fronts. But more recent research has shown that to be a somewhat glamorised view of what actually happened. He had done time for burglary in Manchester before the war, but he'd also been a regular soldier, and he'd done his time as a regular, then gone on to the reserve, and he'd fallen on hard times as a civilian, which was not an uncommon situation, unfortunately, in the Edwardian period, and that's how he ended up turning to crime and being imprisoned. He re-enlisted on the outbreak of the war, and given his previous military service, he was sent to the front quite early on, and was awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery at Camberin, near to the La Bassée Canal, in May of 1915. In the fighting on the 30th of June at the Double Crassier, Giles Eyre in Somme Harvest describes quite a bloody battle at the point of the bayonet, and with a liberal use of grenades, by now Mills grenades, and it's at this point that he witnesses Mariner's death, which he describes in the book. The world becomes a red haze to me, and then Mariner loses his remaining senses. He lets out a roar, scrambles over the trench block and runs down in pursuit of the retreating enemy. We clamber over the block and follow him. Moans and wailing cries come from dim shapes crouching and lolling against the trench sides, and then as I round a corner and glimpse Mariner in the very act of bayoneting a prone German, a whistling swish seems to fill the world. A soul-splitting roar. I feel myself lifted up as if by a giant hand and flung like an empty sack against the further end of the bay. I feel as if my body is being torn asunder by red-hot pincers. What is all this sticky liquid and gobs of flesh spattered all over me? The explanation flashes across my numbed and dazed brain. Mariner, caught full tilt by a shell, has been blown to fragments. There's no poetry there, and indeed in much of Somme Harvest, the author gives quite a brutal description of the experience of war on the Western Front, and it is a very highly recommended memoir from me. So Mariner was killed in action, blown to pieces by the explosion of that shell, and so obviously has no known grave. So as I mentioned previously, the missing from this action, the Royal Sussex lads are on the Loos Memorial, and the King's Royal Rifle Corps men are on the Arras Memorial. But Mariner isn't. His name is inscribed on the Thiepval Memorial to the missing, and quite why that is the case is a mystery. But that's where his name is found, and next time you're at Thiepval, if you look at the King's Royal Rifle Corps columns, you'll find his name, killed not on the Somme, but here in northern France at the Double Crassier, on the eve of the Battle of the Somme. From here we'll continue along this minor road until we get to a crossroads, and there are some modern houses and some 1920s buildings here. This little bit of ground was part of the German forward line of defence. There was a place here called Sniper's Cottage, for example. And this is the route that the 6th and the 7th Londons came through en route towards the double crosshair as part of their attack. At this crossroads we'll turn left. We'll go down a road that runs parallel to the German front line. As we walk down this road, the German front line was largely on the left of this road, and out towards our right, towards the houses we can see on the edge of Cité Maroc. That's looking towards the British front line. It's pretty flat here, and as we'll discover in a minute, this was an area, because of that flatness, because of the openness of it, they decided not to make an actual attack here as part of the Battle of Loos. But as we continue down this road, a little about halfway down before the next junction, on the left-hand side is a concrete bunker, and here we'll stop. The bunker that we're standing alongside is probably not from the Battle of Loos in 1915. It's almost certainly a later, probably observation bunker that the Germans built into one of their forward posts in this part of the line. But from it you can see the sort of observation that the Germans had from their frontline trenches here. And when you look at it, it's pretty open. It's very much a kill zone. So the commander of the 47th Division, the London Division, decided that there wouldn't be an attack in this area. Again, it was a little bit too close to the suburbs of Lens, where they didn't intend to fight. Instead, the two battalions that were here, which was the 1st 21st Londons, the 1st Surrey Rifles, and the 1st 22nd Londons, the Queens, they were in the front line, and they carried out what was the first ever Chinese attack, as it was called. Now, a Chinese attack was a fake attack. It was to draw attention to what you were doing and to draw some of the enemy's fire and attention in your direction rather than the direction of someone else. And what they did to achieve this was the use of a lot of noise, of banging mess tins and the flashing of the blades of bayonets to attract the attention of the Germans on the other side of no man's land, but also the implementation of dummies. Now, these were likely straw dummies, so using Hessian material and some uniforms and peak caps, because this is a period, of course, in which British soldiers did not have steel helmets. And these dummies had been made by the engineers and the pioneers behind the lines, brought up, probably mounted on wooden poles so they could be pushed up above the top of the parapet, the top of the trench, and they were put to good effect here to attract that German attention. In fact, the historian of one of the battalions says they must have been very successful because the dummies were absolutely shot to bits when they looked at them at the end of the day. And this type of ruse, this Chinese attack, was something that was then used again and again throughout the Great War, something that many people have never come across before. When you look at some of the histories of the engineers, they used all sorts of different types of dummy and fake soldiers to draw attention. There were cutouts of soldiers, for example, that would be placed out in the front of trenches that were flat down on a hinge, and you could pull a cord or a bit of rope, and these would then pop up, and it would look as if soldiers had suddenly popped up somewhere near the front line trench and were about to make an attack, and the Germans would shoot at them. So this was a ruse, like I say, to trick the enemy, and something not uncommon in the experience of trench warfare on the Western Front. French army did the same, and although I've not researched that aspect of it, I wouldn't be surprised if the Germans came up with a similar system as well. So there was no attack here, there was no assault across this ground, and come the end of the Battle of Loos, the trench system remained exactly the same as it had done in this area at the very beginning. So there was no advance here. The Germans held on to this ground just beneath this side of the double croisillé until they pulled back through Lens in 1917, and the bunker that we're standing by, I would guess by the design of it, probably dates from around about 1916, when a number of this type of bunker were constructed along this part of the forgotten front. The total casualties sustained by the London Division in the area that we've walked, and the wider area beyond where it attacked towards Loos Village and the lower slopes of Hill 70 in an area called the Garden City and Chalk Pit Wood, for example, were a total of 60 officers and 1,352 men killed, wounded and missing. So compared to some of the other units that attacked on that first day, these casualties were quite light, and the attack for the London Division had been successful, the vast majority of their objectives taken. They'd also captured a large number of German prisoners, machine guns and trench mortars, and the 20th Blackheath and Woolwich Battalion had captured some German field guns close to Chalk Pit Wood, which had been taken back, and they were displayed as war trophies in London following the Battle of Loos. One of them ended up behind some railings on Blackheath itself, as part of the memorial to the 20th Battalion, the London Regiment, the Blackheath and Woolwich Battalion, but it seems to have been scrapped in the Second World War. So from this southern end of the London Division sector for the Battle of Loos, we'll continue down this road beyond the bunker. We're running parallel to the Terril de Loos, the big twin-peaked slag heap to our left, which is where we're heading to next. And to get there, we'll walk down to just short of the bridge over the ring road that goes round Lens, and to our left is a styled entrance into a footpath. We'll go through there, follow the footpath along through a wooded area, and that'll come to a sloping path that takes us up onto the top of the Twin Peaks, just in between them, on a flattened off section overlooking the Loos battlefield, and that'll be our next stop. Where we're standing is on top of the expanded version of the original double crassier, which was this long and narrow stretch of coal slag with the two railway lines on top of it. Later on, post-war, when the Foss 11 pit that's close to here continued to function, more and more of the coal slag was cast out, and this grew and grew to where we see now. When these areas were closed down in the 70s, this was an area of great deprivation in France. It had the highest unemployment rate, social deprivation was rife, and what to do with these massive great terrils, these massive great mountains of coal. And it was decided to turn many of them, like this one, into a form of park, really. One up the road was turned into a dry ski slope, incredibly. This one was an area which you can come up to, as you can now, and wander about. And when you come up here, you find many of the locals walking their dog up here. And on a really bright, clear day, you can see for an incredible distance across this ground. As we go right to the far end, we have a fantastic view right across the Loos battlefield. And if you arm yourself with a decent map of this area and stand up here, you can pick out all the key features from the southern end, where we've walked around the double crassier beneath you, and down to your left back towards Cité Maroc and Maroc British Cemetery. And then ahead you can see the Roman road going from Lens to Bethune, and Dud Corner and the Loos Memorial located there. And you're looking at the area where the men of the 15th Scottish Division went into action. Just beyond that, with a pair of field glasses, pair of binoculars, you should be able to pick out the lone tree in the area where the centre of the attack went in on the 25th of September. Beyond that is St Mary's ADS Cemetery. Further to the north, you can see the pylons going across the fields near to the Hohenzollern Redoubt. And then beyond that, beyond Auchy-les-Bassets, you're looking up towards the Le Bassets Canal on the northern end, where the 19th Western Division went into the attack around Givenchy. So there's a whole swathe of the line there from the initial phase, and then all the later battles with the attacks around the Hohenzollern Redoubt, the assault on Hill 70. Much of this can be seen from where we are now, so it's a great vantage point. And I think if you ever come to the Loos battlefield, no matter which area you're coming to visit or which cemetery you're coming to see, try and come up here to get this overview, really, of this part of the forgotten front, of this part of the Western Front battlefields. So when we stand here looking out across Loos, this is a part of that forgotten front, those battlefields from Armentières to Lens, forgotten to a certain degree by modern visitors, certainly neglected if not forgotten, but not forgotten by those who were here, by them. Who could forget Loos? Who could forget this big push of 1915, when with great hope the men of the new army, the Kitchener's Volunteers, went into battle on the Western Front for the very first time, and alongside them their comrades of the regular army, what was left of it, and territorials like the London lads who we've looked at during the course of this walk. And after the big battle here, this sector at Loos, like so many along the forgotten front, became part of that front line, part of the experience of soldiers going to and from the greater battles of the Western Front, whether it was up to Flanders or down to the Somme and Arras and the Hindenburg line. Unit after unit did their turn in the front line around Loos, staring out across no man's land and through the wire and over the mine craters. This all became part of so many men's war experiences, never forgotten by them, never forgotten. Those days at Loos, looking out into that uncertain future, and perhaps wondering where next they would travel along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line, with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcore. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.